Since I joined DNVR, the question I've been asked the most is who are the Avs going to protect and who is Seattle going to take from them in the expansion draft? Well, now the expansion draft is 10 days away, and we can finally put a decent answer to that question.
Oh my goodness gracious! Wasn't it time? Score! Justice is served!
The expansion draft itself for the Seattle Kraken happens on July 21st. However, the rest of the league, including the Avs, must submit their protected lists on July 17th, so they have to have it in 4 days early. Seattle can then look at the lists, make the decisions about who they want to pick, and also talk to teams about making potential trades. For the Avs, I think this process is pretty simple. There is an outside possibility of a trade happening here or there, but for the most part, they're going to protect their guys and let Seattle take someone. It is going to be very likely the 7 forwards, 3 defensemen, and 1 goaltender option for the Avs. I can't think of a realistic scenario in which they would take 8 skaters and 1 goaltender, but we might talk about one possibility a little bit later. Let's start with the exempt players for Colorado, first of all, because they do have a handful of players relevant to the NHL on this list. They also have prospects like Justus Annunen and others down in the AHL or even in juniors that will not really be available, which is the same for every team. You have an obvious impact player like Bowen Byram, who could matter even more depending on who Seattle takes in this expansion. But where things start getting interesting is the fact that Pavel Francouz also has exempt status. With him not playing at all over the last year, it came together for the Avs and basically made their decision extremely simple on the goaltender end. The list is rounded out by a number of other players that could potentially play in the NHL for the Avs. That includes forwards like Alex Newhook, of course, Martin Count, you already know he is exempt, Connor Timmins on the defensive end, Sampo Rantas as well. Throw in a handful of names that are likely to see some NHL time, they're safe. You also have Adam Werner at the bottom, again, just making that goaltender selection extremely simple for the Avs. Jumping over to that goaltender decision, they're going to protect Philip Grubauer. At this point, basically no matter what. He is a Vezina finalist, an extremely good goaltender, and took the Avs to a President's Trophy this year. Even if they are absolutely sure he's not going to re-sign with the team, they're likely still going to protect him. Because when you look at what they're exposing, there's nothing else worth protecting. No offense to a pending free agent Devin Dubnyk, Jonas Johansson, and Hunter Miska, but there are simply just better goaltender options out there for Seattle, even in a third goaltender position. Things get more interesting for Colorado on the defense and who they are exposing. It starts with Ryan Graves, one of the more likely players for Seattle to select from Colorado. He's going to get exposed no matter what. The Avs just simply don't have the room to protect him. Even if they were to go with an 8 skaters protected list, that would likely be because they needed to protect this next guy in Erik Johnson. EJ has been talked about a lot. There's a lot of conversation around him and his no movement clause. Basically, all that means is that the Avs have to protect him unless one of 3 things happen. Either he waives his no-move clause willingly, he gets traded, or the Avs buy him out. One of those 3 things are going to happen, and possibly 2 of them. The most likely scenario is that EJ simply waives his no-movement clause, and that is the end of it. Seattle doesn't select him, and you just continue on. However, with his $6 million cap hit, the Avs may look to make a trade, potentially, and that is something that is not very likely, but if they want to free up money to make a bigger move, it's likely EJ that would get shipped out. Whether that's a conversation with Seattle or potentially a different team remains to be seen. In a world where EJ won't waive his no-movement clause, it's extremely likely that the Avs would just buy him out to free up that protected slot. There's a chance, even if he does, that the Avs' best move may be buying him out if they cannot find a trade partner and don't want to hold all that money. Yes, they would still have the $2 million of dead cap from the buyout, but that's a whole lot less than 6. Again, there's no real reason for Seattle to take him if he's exposed, because they could take Ryan Graves, a perfectly serviceable NHL defenseman who is younger and costs about half as much instead. If Seattle really wanted a cheap defenseman, there are also a couple of other options like Jacob McDonald that they could take, as well as a few not listed here. Patrick Nemeth as a free agent if they wanted to sign him to a certain contract. Look, these are possibilities, but unlikely. Again, if Seattle doesn't want to spend money, they're there. Realistically, Ryan Graves, though, is the pick on the defensive side. So a lot of this comes down to the players that the Avs are protecting defensively. Cale Makar and Sam Girard are hard locks. They're 1 and 2. They're going to get protected literally no matter what. So you don't even have to think about them. The interesting one here is Devon Toews, who came over to the Avs and played great. Definitely earned that third protected slot. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But it does lock the Avs in a little bit. If they wanted to go out and acquire another defenseman, a lot of the rumors around Seth Jones, for example, it would be very hard to do that before the expansion draft. This is the scenario where the Avs would have to go to 8 skaters if they acquired a high-end defenseman in a trade. They're not going to do that, though, so it's not a big worry. If they were going to make a trade like that, it would come after the expansion draft. So while the interesting side of the defense is who they are exposing, the interesting side of the forwards is who they are going to protect. Now, the top 5, I think, are extremely straightforward if they're going 7-3-1. Obviously McKinnon, obviously Rantanen, obviously Landeskog, and then you have obviously Burakovsky as well, most likely. I think you also have obviously Kadri. In my opinion, it's an auto lock, but there are people who would like to see him potentially exposed. I wouldn't do that. Kadri, even if you don't want him on Colorado for whatever reason, has value as a 2-center in the NHL. You protect that basically straight up for the asset. You can trade him later and get value that way, instead of giving him away for absolutely nothing. That brings us to the last 2 spots on the list. I put Tyson Jost and Val Nichushkin in those spots. I think those are the 2 most likely, especially Tyson Jost. Jost is going to be quite cheap. He's quite young. He fits in nicely on the Avs' third line and can play center. There are a lot of reasons to keep Tyson Jost protected, especially because the Avs are likely looking to expose money, again, to free up some financial ability to make moves this offseason. The Nichushkin spot, I think, is more contested. You have Nichushkin. I think it's a perfectly good option to protect him. That's what I would do. He's making $2.5 million for another year. Obviously provides very solid defense on a third line for you, with occasional scoring hot streaks. The other option there, however, is Jonas Donskoi. And if that's something you would prefer, or if the Avs would prefer, I think it's perfectly valid to protect him as well. But these are the 7 forwards I think the Avs will protect. Pretty confident in the top 6 of that at very least. And that leads us to the Avs exposed forwards. Again, you have a handful of random options, pending UFAs, veterans like Belmar and Calvert, but where things actually focus in here is JT Compher and then Jonas Donskoi. Donskoi makes a lot of sense, I think, for Seattle. He has experience, he's been in multiple playoffs, including 1 finals, and also produces pretty consistently. It's pretty realistic to see him holding value for someone like Seattle, except for he doesn't play center, and that's where JT Compher comes into the conversation. Compher is capable of playing center. He's also a good bit younger than Donskoi, and a smidge cheaper. Not a lot. Both players making over $3 million. Compher at $3.5. Donskoi at a little more. I believe a 3.9. These are my 2 primary forward choices for Seattle, so you're very likely looking at one of Compher, Donskoi, or Graves ending up in Seattle from Colorado. Again, if Seattle was looking to not spend any money, they could go with depth options like Kiefer Sherwood or Logan O'Connor, try to get those guys on term as maybe a 4th liner or 13th forward type, but that seems unlikely. I do think Seattle will target Colorado as a team they can get a skill player from. Another possible trade option would be to entice Seattle to take something like JT Compher, or maybe add on some other type of deal to get even more money out from the team. but I would say that Seattle takes Jonas Donskoi from the Avs, and that's that. Nothing special, nothing fancy. The Avs lose their guy, and they move on. So, there you have it. That is my preview of the Avs protected list for this upcoming expansion draft. Pretty realistic look at it, I think, unless the Avs do something totally crazy before the draft or during it. Anything is possible, but safe to expect something reasonable from Colorado here, and then they can make their moves post-expansion draft, whether it be at the entry draft, in free agency, or wherever they see fit. That is the end of this Avalanche off-season preview. Thank you for watching. Please check us out at thednvr.com. I am Rudo, and I will see you with a video with a whole lot of posts in it very soon.